Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum students. This is Qalab Abbas and I'm here with another lecture on project management. As you know that in the previous class, in the previous lecture, we have concluded our discussion on what is meant by power interest grid metrics and how we can use stakeholders engagement metrics in order to develop strategies of managing different stakeholders. We initiated our discussion on stakeholder management in the previous class. We have also identified that what is meant by stakeholders and how we can develop a list of all the potential stakeholders of a certain project. In this very lecture, we are going to discuss that how we can improve upon and what are the problems that managers faces when they are in the implementation process of this strategic implementation that we have discussed in the previous classes. So in this chapter, we are going to learn that what are the challenges of managing stakeholders. We would also be discussing upon all the problems and mistakes project managers make while they are managing relationships or engaging all the stakeholders. And we are also going to discuss all the strategies that can actually make this whole process of managing the communications with the stakeholders as smooth as possible. So in today's lecture, we are going to conclude our discussion on stakeholder relationship management. So as I've told you before, that it is very important for the project manager to not only identify all the stakeholders, but also to identify that what power, influence, and the authority these stakeholders are bringing on to this very project. Because if he would not be able to predict that, he would never be able to predict the actions these stakeholders are going to take. And if he is going to underestimate the overall power and influence of a certain stakeholder, he is risking the life of a complete project. So that is why it is very important that the stakeholders are identified and the project manager also predicts that what kind of actions they can take. So here are some of the problems and some of the challenges and sometimes some of the mistakes that project managers make while identifying and managing the complete relationship process. The very first mistake that the project manager makes is that he fails to identify the stakeholders. As we have discussed in the previous slides as well, it is easier said than done that you can identify our stakeholders. Many times, many experienced managers, they fail to identify the stakeholders and they fail to identify the variables. As I have told you that the project management or the project requires very diverse skills, and many times the project manager fails to predict or he fails to identify that what kind of skill sets are required in order to complete a project. Many times the overall environment of the project also keeps on changing. The environment is very dynamic. Because of that, new stakeholders emerge. And many times lots of very experienced stakeholders, they also fail to identify the stakeholders at the very start of the project. Another major reason is that in the initial planning processes, many times there are certain individuals that are very loud. By loud, I mean that they try to influence the complete discussion on the basis of their own ideas and their own thinking. And they divert the discussion toward what they believe is right. And many times the team members who have an idea of a certain stakeholders, but he is unable to communicate that in a proper way, he fails to communicate that they have identified a very good stakeholders. Because of this reason, in the very initial planning phase, the project manager fails to identify some of the stakeholders. It becomes the responsibility of the project manager to give this particular chance to each and every team member to identify all the possible stakeholders. If one particular person is providing all the information, this goes against the whole theme of the project management. As I've told you, the theme of the project management, the philosophy of the project management is that the team should always give a preference on the individuals. But if individuals are dominating a discussion, then it would be very difficult for the project manager to not only identify the strategy, but also to identify the stakeholders that are going to impact the project. Another mistake that project managers make is that they fail to understand that what kind of communication method they can use in order to communicate or in order to convey information to a certain stakeholder. Here, the project manager needs to identify that getting the right information at the right time is very important. And it is also very hard. Every piece of communication that the project distributes should have a purpose, or every piece of information that the project manager is giving to different stakeholders should be provided because there is a certain reason. For example, the project manager should know that why he is providing the information. Is he going to inform? Is he going to create an influence? Is he going to create some controversy, or is he going to enhance the relationship? What is going to be the purpose of this communication? And then the second part is that what should be the right methodology, who should be the right carrier, what should be the right medium of conveying that very information. If the project manager gets it wrong, he would never be able to develop a good relationship with the stakeholder. So another mistake that project manager should not do is that he should not underestimate the power that each and every stakeholder is bringing. As I have told you, that one of the biggest reasons that why lots of foreign project fails, and why the project managers that are on a foreign assignments, they leave those projects behind and they come back, because they fail to predict the power their family has over them, and the organization also fails to predict it, and they make all these strategies of how to manage the competitors, how to manage the suppliers, how to manage the overall environment with the client, but they fail to manage that how the family life of the project manager is going to be impacted. So one of the biggest reason for why Japanese expats or UK and US expats come back from a foreign assignment is that because they get influenced by their family members. So that is very important that each and every stakeholder is identified and their power and influence is also identified correctly. Another major mistake that many of the project managers normally do is that they fail to group their stakeholders. Now, what is meant by grouping? By grouping, it means that many times a certain stakeholder is not an individual person. He is part of a huge group. So when you are dealing with that stakeholder, you are not dealing with an individual person, you are dealing with a department, or you are dealing with an organization. So that is why it is very important that whenever you are going to communicate with a certain person, you need to identify that what group or what particular community he belongs to. For example, if you are going to start a construction project at a certain community, your neighbors or the people that are living around you, yes, they are individuals, but they are also part of a huge community. If as a community, if they collectively become resistant to your construction project, you would never be able to complete your project on time, or you would never be able to complete that very project on time, or you would be requiring some strategies in order to complete that project. You cannot simply ignore these individuals if they are part of a certain larger group. Another mistake that the project managers normally make while they are identifying and while they are developing strategies to manage stakeholders is that they fail to identify the stakeholder needs. Here, I want you to remember that needs are not requirements. Requirements are specific attributes of your deliverables within the very project. Need, on the other hand, are basically related to the ongoing demands from your stakeholders during that very project. For example, if your project is going to deliver a machinery that is going to replace the shop floor workers, then your shop floor workers are going to resist the implementation and the development of such machinery. So basically, there are two different things. The deliverables of that project can be different, and the need of each and every stakeholder can also be different. One way a project manager can actually manage the relationship with all different stakeholders is to group them or to develop a grid that can let him know that who are resistant and who are in support of certain managerial or certain project actions. For example, right in front of you, I have given you an example of a table where each and every row is basically represent one action that you are going to take. And each and every column is going to represent that what are those actions and whether they are supportive, or who are the team members or who are the people that are going to be resistant to that very action. For example, if you look at production cost reduction, so this particular action is going to be supported by the customer, but it is not going to be supported by the finance or your competitors. On the other hand, if you look at the third row, which is increased sales prices, this is supported supported by the shareholders and the finances, but it is not supported by the customers and the distributors. So by developing this kind of a table, you can actually identify that how each and every action is going to be taken by different team members or by different stakeholders. This can give you an idea that for which action you are going to talk to which particular stakeholder, or what particular stakeholder is more important regarding what particular action you are going to take as a project manager. Another mistake that different project managers make while they are managing the relationship with the stakeholders is that they fail to allocate resources efficiently. Why this happens? This happens because they fail to identify the power and interest of a certain stakeholder, and they predict that a certain stakeholder is more important than others, and they use up all of their resources in order to satisfy or in order to communicate with a certain stakeholder which they believe is more important, and they miss some of the stakeholders that have power and that have influence. This can have some very serious implications on the life of the project. If you fail or if you ignore a certain stakeholder, and if you have also failed to predict the power and influence of that stakeholder, then you are basically risking the complete health and complete life of the project. Another basic mistake that many project managers make, and I do not want you to make this mistake when you are managing your project, is that they fail to identify or they fail to understand the rewards that the stakeholders want out of a certain project. Our stakeholders will typically expect some form of price for their contributions within the project. For example, the project manager is there because maybe the project management organization has committed a certain compensation to that person. The core team members are there because they are also expecting some compensations. The employees are supporting that very project because maybe they believe that because of this very project the organization would improve and their jobs would also improve. As it is written here, for example, the manager is giving or he is spending all the time because he expects that success may help his career. In supporting a business change programs, employee may expect better working conditions. So you also need to understand that what all of these different stakeholders want to get out of this very project. When it comes to the external stakeholders, this information becomes more important. For example, if you are going to construct a football ground in a certain community, you need to understand that why certain people are supporting and why certain people are very resistant to this very project. You need to understand that what people want to get out of this very project, and finding the right price and not to underpay each and every stakeholder is a crucial and is key to successful project management. Another very major mistake that lots of project managers make, and we have discussed it again and again, and I would not be spending much time over this, is that we fail to associate the risk and we fail to identify the risk that is associated with each and every stakeholder, and we fail to register it in the stakeholder register. We basically underestimate the power and influence of a certain stakeholder. Another major mistake that a project managers normally make while they are developing or while they are making strategies in order to maintain a relationship is that they fail to predict that how different stakeholders or how other stakeholders are going to impact some other stakeholders. As I have told you before, that team members, they get influenced by other team members. Clients, they get impacts by some other clients. Community individuals, they get impacted by their neighbors or by other people. Governmental departments, sometimes they get impacted by individuals. If your organization is going to conduct a certain project in a community and the complete community is there on the roads and they are striking against your organization and they are making life very difficult for all the people that are working on that very project, then the government would intervene and the government would come and they would investigate that what is going on, why people are so against you. So that is why one particular stakeholder do sometimes get impacted by some other stakeholders. In many of the organizations, especially in such organizations which are very labor intensive, there are certain labor unions. These labor unions also impact the thinking, they also impact the opinions of the labor that is working in that very organization. So that is why it is also very important for the stakeholder and for the project manager to identify identify that how these stakeholders are getting impacted by other stakeholders and what are the opinion leaders that many stakeholders are basically following. So if we can develop a strategy that we can somehow win over these opinion leaders, we can win over these stakeholders very easily. The last problem that I'm going to discuss with you today is the incorrect management strategy used. Many times identifying the right stakeholders, identifying the right power or right influence can have absolutely no meaning if you have not developed the right strategy to communicate with that very stakeholder. Many times the product team, they choose inappropriate strategy to deal with the particular stakeholders. And in many cases, this strategy is not one size fit all approach that can just be rolled out across all the stakeholders. The project manager needs to identify that each and every stakeholder is an individual problem. They have their own needs, they have their own power, they have their own influence, and they have their own rewards in their mind regarding that very project. That is why one particular strategy that can fit all cannot be developed. You need to develop a strategy that is individual. You need to customize your strategy for each and every stakeholder that you have identified. So what can be the suggestions or what can be some of the recommendations that I can give you in order to develop good relationship with the stakeholders? So my biggest recommendation is that you need to follow the best practices. Now what is meant by best practices? By best practices I mean that you need to be very clear from the start. You need to give them the right type of information. You need to explain them the right consequences. You do not need to give them all the positives about the project. You also need to tell them that what can be the problems or what can be certain issues that they would face during the life cycle of the project. You should also have a contingency plan. As I've told you, that the project manager should identify that what are the stakeholders which can never be won over. What are the stakeholders that can never be convinced about the positive impact of the project. How the project manager is going to deal with them. What is the contingency plan? The project manager should have that in mind. The project manager should also gather information. As I've told you, the project manager should never ever underestimate any certain stakeholder, because if you are underestimating a stakeholder, you are in for some huge surprises. As a project manager, you should avoid surprises, because as I've told you, the environment, the skill sets that are required, the overall variables that are there are also going to change. And even if you are an experienced project manager, you would be unable to identify or take into account all the variables that are there in order to complete the project in time. On top of that, if your stakeholders are making your life very difficult, it would be very difficult for you to manage that very project. This means that you need to gather as much information as you can, and you need to plan your project to such a level that you can avoid all these surprises. And at the end, another very important suggestion that I can give you is that sometimes you need to take a stand. Sometimes you need to show the stakeholders that this is the only way we can move forward, because you are the responsible for completing this project in time according to the specifications and within a certain budget. So if your stakeholders are not supporting you, or if your stakeholders are creating problems, at a certain point in time you have to take stand and you need to convince them that this is the only way. So my question to you, my students, is that can you control your stakeholders? Can you influence their opinions? Can you win them over? I want you to pause my video at this point in time and try to internalize this very question and try to answer this question in your mind, that can you control a stakeholder if you know what he wants, if you know what he wants to get out of a certain project, and if you know that whether he is resistant or supportive to a certain project. Welcome back. I hope that you have found the right answer. If not, you can also post this question in the Google Classroom and we would have a discussion on this very question, that whether we can control the engagement with the stakeholders or not. So let us discuss some of the ways Now coming back to my lecture, let us discuss some of the ways we can control the engagements. Number one thing that we can do in order to have a healthy relationship is that we need to have participation of all of these stakeholders. In all the planning phases, in all the planning implementation phases, we need to have the representatives of all of these stakeholders that have huge power and influence on that very project. If we are not participating them in the discussion, they would create problem in the implementation phase. So from the political point of view, it is also very important to have their feedback or have their suggestions incorporated into the overall planning process. Another thing that we can do in order to have a smooth engagement is that we need to have engagement activities and deliverables throughout the project. We need to show them that where we are standing, and we need to have strong monitoring and control procedures that are telling not only to the project managers but also to the stakeholders that where we are heading and whether the project is on time or not, and whether we should be completing this project on schedule or we should be delaying or we require more resources or not. So updated information is very much important when it comes to managing and controlling the engagement. At the end, as I have told you before, it is very important that you identify that what are all of these stakeholders, and you can also go one step ahead. Instead of just inviting them to be part of the discussion in the planning process, you can invite them to be part of the team which is going to implement the project as well. Many of the IT organizations, whenever they take up a huge project, for example Northwest Airline or some other IT company, they invite employees from these client organizations to come and work with them so that they can have the ready feedback, so that they can have a very quick feedback from the people who are going to use that very project. So instead of by just inviting them and being part of the planning process, you should be inviting them to being part of the team which is going to complete or which is going to conduct the implementation of that project. So this brings me to the end of my today's lecture. In this very chapter, we have discussed very important things. We have identified that what are stakeholders or what is meant by being a stakeholder. We have also identified that how we can develop a list of all the multiple stakeholders. We have also developed a plan that how we can use the power and interest grid in order to categorize all of these stakeholders, and how we can use the stakeholders engagement metrics in order to identify and predict that what should be the level of engagement with each and every stakeholder. We have also in this lecture identified that what can be the problems or what can be the limitations or mistakes that the project managers can do, and he should be avoiding these mistakes if they want to develop a smooth relationships with the stakeholders. This brings me to the end of my today's lecture. In our next interactive session, there is going to be a presentation. In that presentation, each and every group would actually mention that what are their stakeholders and what is the list and how they can actually classify them by using power interest grid. So I'm very excited that you would be identifying your stakeholders after listening to my lecture, and you would also be identifying that how you can categorize all of these stakeholders into different categories using the engagement metrics and power interest metrics. Till then, I want you to take very good care of yourself. Allah Hafiz.